December 7th, 1941. A quiet Sunday morning in paradise. Palm trees swayed gently in the Hawaiian breeze, and the sun glinted on the calm blue waters of Pearl Harbor. We must journey back to a world teetering on the precipice, a world where old empires crumbled and new. Aggressive ideologies clawed their way to power. Introduction to the world stage. A shadow creeps across the globe. In Europe, the scars of the First World War had barely begun to heal before new storm clouds gathered. Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany was rearming at an alarming pace. Fueled by a virulent ideology of racial supremacy and territorial expansion. His regime, born from the ashes of post-Versailles resentment and economic despair, preached a doctrine of Lebensraum, living space, that could only be achieved through conquest. The Rhineland had been remilitarized, Austria annexed in the Anschluss, and Czechoslovakia dismembered at Munich, each act of aggression testing the resolve of a fragile international community that consistently chose appeasement over confrontation, a world that was already irrevocably at war. His invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, a brutal and technologically asymmetrical conflict, served as an early chilling demonstration of modern warfare's destructive potential. Mussolini, the self-proclaimed Il Duce, aligned his ambitions with Hitler's, forming the Rome-Berlin Axis, a partnership of dictatorships bent on overturning the established world order. The Spanish Civil War, a proxy conflict fought by ideological forces across Europe, further highlighted the growing ideological divide and the willingness of these new powers to intervene militarily. For thousands of American servicemen and their families, it was a day of rest, of church, of leisure, but in a brutal instant, that tranquility shattered. The skies erupted, filled with the roar of engines and the thunder of bombs. For a nation that had desperately clung to peace, a nation far removed from the fires consuming Europe and Asia, this was the moment everything changed. This was Pearl Harbor. And this was the beginning of a conflict that would drag America, and indeed the world, into its darkest, most defining hour. To truly understand the cataclysm that unfolded on that infamous Sunday, we must rewind. Far beyond the serene shores of Oahu. 1.1. The 1930s were a decade of stark contrasts, of dazzling innovation and crushing poverty, of cultural flourishing and rising fascism. To the south, Benito Mussolini's fascist Italy dreamed of restoring the glory of the Roman Empire. But the fires of aggression weren't confined to Europe. Across the vast Pacific, another formidable power was on the ascendancy, Imperial Japan. And stood defiantly during the Battle of Britain, America remained seemingly detached. For many Americans, these were distant quarrels, tragedies unfolding in lands far away. There was a prevailing, almost comforting illusion that the vast oceans provided an impenetrable shield, safeguarding the United States from the world's escalating chaos. Throughout the 1930s, polls consistently showed a strong majority of Americans opposed to any foreign wars. This wasn't just apathy, it was a deeply held conviction that America's best course was to focus on its own prosperity and internal affairs, insulated from the old world's endless conflicts. The scars of the Great Depression, which still gripped the nation through much of the decade, made domestic issues paramount. Americans rightly felt that their primary battle was at home: unemployment, poverty, and economic recovery. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, a shrewd politician and a keen observer of international affairs, recognized the profound and growing danger posed by the aggressive expansion of totalitarian powers. His challenge was immense: how to prepare a nation for war when that nation was deeply committed to peace, both emotionally and legally. In 1937, he delivered his famous quarantine speech in Chicago, suggesting that aggressor nations should be quarantined. To protect the international community from the epidemic of world lawlessness, he declared, there must be positive endeavors to preserve peace. America hates war. America hopes for peace. Therefore, America actively engages in the search for peace. However, he added, when an epidemic of physical disease starts to spread, the community approves and joins in a quarantine of the patients in order. To protect the health of the community against the spread of the disease, the reaction was swift and largely negative. The public wasn't ready to hear such strong words, fearing they were a prelude to war. Newspapers denounced it, and political opponents seized upon it as evidence of Roosevelt's interventionist desires. From his vantage point in the White House, the relentless march of Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan wasn't just a distant problem, it was a direct threat to global stability, to democratic ideals, and eventually to American security. He understood that the oceans, vast as they were, could not indefinitely protect America from a world consumed by tyranny. He believed that unchecked aggression would only breed more aggression, ultimately reaching America's shores. Roosevelt had seen the consequences of appeasement firsthand and was convinced that the Axis powers would not stop until they met firm resistance. Diverting precious resources and manpower to distant wars seemed not just foolhardy, but almost a betrayal of those struggling within their own borders. This sentiment of detachment, however, would soon be tested like never before. The Neutrality Acts passed between 1935 and 1939 aimed to restrict America's involvement by prohibiting the sale of arms to warring nations, banning loans. With influential voices like aviator Charles Lindbergh, Sears Roebuck executive Robert E. Wood, and Senator Burton K. Wheeler, the committee galvanized public opinion against intervention, arguing that America's strength lay in its own defense, not in fighting overseas wars. They believed engaging in foreign conflicts would inevitably lead to disaster, sacrificing American lives and resources for no tangible gain. Their message resonated deeply with a population still reeling from economic hardship and weary of global strife. The popular slogan, "The Yanks are not coming," captured the mood of the nation. And later requiring belligerents to pay cash and transport goods on their own ships, the so-called cash and carry policy, these laws were a direct reflection of the prevailing desire to avoid the entanglements that many believed had pulled the U.S. into World War I. They were designed to insulate the American economy from the demands of wartime trade and to ensure that no financial interests could push the nation toward conflict. Driven by a potent mix of economic necessity, nationalist fervor, and a belief in its divine destiny to lead Asia, Japan had embarked on a brutal campaign of conquest that had already been raging for years. Its full-scale invasion of China in 1937 marked a new, horrifying chapter in Asian history. What began with the Marco Polo Bridge incident escalated into a widespread conflict characterized by unspeakable atrocities, such as the rape of Nanking and a relentless push for regional dominance. Japan's militaristic government saw itself as destined to create a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a concept that was, in practice, a euphemism for a vast Japanese empire. While Europe watched Germany engulf Poland in 1939, triggering the official start of World War II, then quickly swallow France in 1940, 1.2. American isolationism, the appeal of neutrality. Why did America cling so fiercely to this idea of isolation? Its roots ran deep, etched into the nation's very foundation. From George Washington's farewell address, which famously advised the fledgling republic to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world, to the profound disillusionment that followed the brutal, seemingly futile slaughter of World War I, that war, meant to make the world safe for democracy, had left millions dead, economies shattered across Europe, and an enduring cynicism among Americans about the efficacy and wisdom of interventionism. The nation had sent its sons to fight and die in muddy trenches thousands of miles away, only to witness the rise of new dictatorships and the return of global instability. Many felt betrayed by the outcome and resolved never to be drawn into such a conflict again. The public sentiment was overwhelmingly against repeating that nightmare. This sentiment found expression in a series of legislative acts designed to prevent the nation from being dragged into future global conflicts. Prominent figures and powerful movements championed this stance. The America First Committee, formed in 1940, quickly became the most prominent non-interventionist pressure group in the United States. 1.3. Cracks in the facade. Franklin D. Roosevelt's shifting stance. Yet, even as the majority of Americans clung to isolation, one man in Washington held a different, more somber view. Roosevelt began a slow, deliberate, and politically perilous dance away from strict neutrality. But FDR persisted. As Hitler's Germany marched through Europe, swallowing Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and finally France, Roosevelt found increasingly innovative ways to support the Allied nations without formally declaring war. The cash and carry provision of the Neutrality Acts was amended in 1939 to allow the sale of arms to belligerents, provided they paid immediately and transported the goods themselves. This was a direct benefit to Britain and France, who possessed the naval capacity and financial resources to take advantage of it. For decades, Imperial Japan had been pursuing its own vision of regional dominance, a grand design known as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This was presented by Japanese propagandists as an initiative to free Asian nations from oppressive Western colonial rule, fostering a new cooperative order under Japanese leadership. In reality, it was a thinly veiled ambition to establish Japan as the undisputed hegemon of Asia, controlling vast territories and their immense resources. As Japan pressed further south into Indochina in 1940 and 1941, taking advantage of France's defeat by Germany, America's concerns escalated dramatically. These moves directly threatened U.S. interests and the balance of power in Asia. The stage was being set for a clash of titans, a collision course fueled by Japan's desperate ambition for resources and mastery, and America's evolving stance from isolation to a recognition of its role as a global power. The storm was not just brewing, it was gathering immense force, and its epicenter would soon shift to a tranquil harbor in the middle of the Pacific, thousands of miles from the conflicts in Europe and mainland Asia. The countdown to December 7th had truly begun. The rhetoric of liberation masked a brutal program of conquest, resource extraction, and exploitation. Unlike many Western democracies where civilian control over the military was paramount, in Imperial Japan, the armed forces held immense political power and influence. The Manchurian Incident of 1931 saw Japanese forces swiftly seize Manchuria from China, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo. This act of blatant aggression, largely unchallenged by the League of Nations, emboldened the militarists in Tokyo. The full-scale invasion of China in 1937, following the Marco Polo Bridge incident, marked a new level of conflict. This wasn't a quick war. It was a brutal, protracted struggle that consumed vast amounts of Japanese resources and manpower. Cities like Shanghai and Nanjing fell, the latter witnessing the horrific rape of Nanking. A brutal spree of murder, rape, and looting that shocked the world and forever stained Japan's reputation. Despite these atrocities and the deep quagmire in China, the Japanese leadership remained convinced of its rightful place as the leader of a new Asian order, an order they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a term that veiled their true imperial ambitions under a veneer of Pan-Asian liberation. Key positions in the government were often filled by active or retired military officers, and the military budget consistently consumed a vast portion of the national revenue. Major industrial conglomerates known as zaibatsu were intimately connected with the military, profiting immensely from expansion and war. This symbiosis between military and industry created a powerful lobbying force that consistently pushed for aggressive foreign policy and territorial expansion, driven by both ideological conviction and economic interest. Then came the Destroyer for Bases deal in September 1940. A remarkable agreement where the U.S. exchanged 50 aging World War I NERA destroyers for naval base access in British territories in the Atlantic, stretching from Newfoundland to the Caribbean. Despite its technological advancements and industrial growth, it possessed very little oil, iron, or rubber, or tin, all vital for its modern military machine and its industrial economy. Control of these resources would provide Japan with the vital raw materials. It desperately needed to break free from its dependence on foreign imports, particularly from the United States. But from Tokyo's perspective, America itself represented an insurmountable obstacle. The stage was set for a confrontation not just of ideologies, but of two vastly different perceptions of destiny and survival. To understand the audacious gamble Japan was about to take, we must look deeper into the heart of its empire, its military doctrine, its economic vulnerabilities, and the desperate calculations of its leaders. This dream of a self-sufficient, resource-rich empire, however, meant directly confronting the established colonial powers, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, who held sway over these territories. And more importantly, it meant challenging the growing economic and strategic interests of the United States in the region. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 had ignited an era of astonishing modernization, industrialization, and military buildup. Guided by the desire to achieve parity with, and eventually surpass, Western colonial powers, Japan had aggressively pursued its own empire. Victories over China in 1895 and, astonishingly, over Tsarist Russia in 1905 solidified its position as the dominant power in East Asia. These triumphs fueled a potent sense of national pride and a belief in Japan's unique destiny to lead Asia, freeing it from perceived Western exploitation. Its initial conquests in Manchuria in 1931 and the subsequent full-scale invasion of China in 1937 had provided some resources, particularly coal and iron, but these were insufficient to meet the ever-growing demands of its war economy and its ambitious expansion plans. The war in China, far from being a quick victory, had become a costly quagmire, draining Japan's limited resources further. This provided Britain with desperately needed naval assets to defend against German U-boats, and gave the U.S. vital strategic outposts for its own defense. These were significant steps, but the true turning point came with the Lend-Lease Act of March 1941. This groundbreaking legislation allowed the U.S. to lend or lease war materials, including weapons, ammunition, food, and machinery, to any nation whose defense the President deemed vital to the defense of the United States. It was, as Roosevelt famously put it in a fireside chat, like lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire. He argued, "If your neighbor's house catches fire, you don't say, 'I want $15,000 for my garden hose.' You lend it to him and get it back after the fire is out." This act effectively circumvented the Neutrality Acts and transformed the United States into the arsenal of democracy, providing crucial aid to Britain and later the Soviet Union after Germany's invasion, directly challenging the Axis powers without deploying American troops to the battlefield. The nation was still technically at peace, but it was actively preparing for and contributing to a global conflict that many understood was rapidly approaching its shores. 1.4. The Pacific Chessboard. Japan's imperial ambitions. While the world's gaze was primarily fixed on the unfolding drama in Europe, an equally dangerous game was playing out in the Pacific. Japan, a rapidly industrializing nation with a burgeoning population and a powerful, increasingly influential military, faced a critical challenge: a severe lack of natural resources. Southeast Asia, with its rich oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, its vast rubber plantations in British Malaya, its tin mines, and its strategic waterways, became the tantalizing prize for Japan. The U.S. had long-standing ties and economic interests in the Pacific, particularly with China, and its own territory of the Philippines lay directly in Japan's path. Part 2. Japan's Path to War. Ambition, Desperation, and Miscalculation. The United States, slowly awakening from its isolationist slumber, saw the danger in Japan's expansion. 2.1. Imperial Doctrine and Expansion. A nation's destiny, Japan's rapid rise from an isolated feudal state to a formidable world power was a marvel of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This fervent nationalism was deeply intertwined with the nation's military. The desire for resources and strategic territory led Japan to relentless expansion. The United States, while attempting to remain neutral, could not ignore Japan's escalating aggression. Initially, American diplomatic efforts involved warnings and mild sanctions, attempting to deter Japan through economic pressure. However, these proved insufficient. The critical turning point came in July 1941, when Japan made a decisive move. It invaded and occupied southern French Indochina. This was a direct threat to British Malaya, with its vital rubber and tin, and the immensely rich oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. It was, for the United States, a clear red line crossed. Yamamoto was a complex character, uniquely positioned among Japan's military elite. He had studied at Harvard and served as a naval in Washington, D.C., giving him an intimate, first-hand understanding of America's vast industrial capacity and its formidable potential for war. Unlike many of his peers who vastly underestimated American resolve and manufacturing power, Yamamoto harbored no illusions. He knew that a prolonged war against the United States was a war Japan could not win. Genda's task was to translate Yamamoto's strategic vision into a feasible attack plan, addressing the seemingly insurmountable challenges of launching a devastating aerial assault on a heavily defended naval base. Japanese pilots, many of them veterans of the war in China, practiced relentlessly in simulated conditions, perfecting their dive bombing, high-level bombing, and shallow water torpedo runs. They meticulously studied reconnaissance photographs of Pearl Harbor, even building a large-scale model of the base for practice runs. Strict radio silence was enforced from the moment the Kido Butai departed its remote base in the Kuriles Islands on November 26, 1941. False radio. Traffic was generated from Japan to create the illusion that the fleet remained in home waters. The operation was known only to a select few within the highest echelons of the Imperial Navy and government. Even the sailors and airmen on board the ships were not informed of their true destination until days before the attack, ensuring that the element of surprise, the linchpin of Yamamoto's plan, would be preserved. This rigorous training ensured that the pilots would be precise and devastatingly effective on the day of the attack. The primary obstacle was Pearl Harbor's shallow waters, which traditionally rendered aerial torpedo attacks ineffective. American codebreakers had achieved a remarkable feat, breaking Japan's diplomatic cipher, known as magic. These intercepts provided high-level insights into Japanese intentions and communications, including the escalating tensions and Japan's growing frustration with the U.S. embargo. American officials knew that something was coming, that Japan was preparing for military action, but they tragically misread where and when that action would occur. Comprising 6 of Japan's most advanced aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Haryu, Shakaku, and Zuikaku. It carried over 400 aircraft, including the formidable Zero fighters, Val dive bombers, and Kate torpedo bombers. This was the largest and most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled, a testament to Japan's technological prowess and its commitment to carrier-based naval air power. Standard torpedoes dropped from aircraft would dive too deep and embed themselves in the harbor floor. Genda's team, however, devised an ingenious solution, attaching wooden fins to the torpedoes, preventing them from diving too deep and allowing them to run true in the shallow depths. This innovation was a game-changer, transforming the battleships, previously thought safe from torpedo attacks in Pearl Harbor, into vulnerable targets. President Roosevelt's response was swift and decisive. "If I am told to fight regardless of the consequences, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year." His strategy was a desperate gamble: cripple the American fleet at the outset of hostilities, thus buying Japan crucial time, perhaps 6 months to a year, to consolidate its gains in Southeast Asia, secure vital resources, and establish an impregnable defensive perimeter. The hope was that, faced with a heavily fortified Japanese empire and a significantly weakened navy, the United States might be forced to negotiate a peace settlement favorable to Japan. This was not a plan for conquest of America, but a plan to incapacitate its ability to wage war in the Pacific long enough for Japan to achieve its strategic objectives and dictate terms. He envisioned the attack as a dagger to the throat of the American fleet. Single, devastating strike that would momentarily paralyze its adversary. It was a strategy born not of overconfidence, but of desperation and a clear-eyed assessment of Japan's limited window of opportunity. But I have utterly no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year. He understood that Japan lacked the economic and industrial base to sustain a protracted conflict against a nation that could outproduce it by an order of magnitude. However, once the decision for war was made by the Imperial General Headquarters, Yamamoto, a man of profound duty and loyalty, committed himself entirely to achieving the best possible outcome for his nation. He understood that a direct, decisive blow was Japan's only hope. On July 26, 1941, the United States, in coordination with Britain and the Dutch East Indies, implemented a full oil embargo against Japan. This was a crippling blow. Japan imported approximately 80% of its oil from the United States. Its military, its navy, and its entire industrial economy were utterly reliant on this foreign supply. Without oil, Japan's war machine would grind to a halt within months. Its strategic reserves were limited, estimated to last only 18 to 24 months at wartime consumption rates. The embargo was not just an inconvenience. It was an act of economic strangulation, a direct threat to Japan's very existence as a modern, expansionist power. This drastic measure ignited a fierce internal debate within the Japanese leadership. One faction, led by Prime Minister Fumimaro Kano, advocated for continued diplomatic negotiations with the U.S. and a strategic withdrawal from some of Japan's gains in China, hoping to lift the embargo. They recognized the immense industrial and military disparity between Japan and the United States and feared the consequences of a direct conflict. However, the hardline militarist faction, dominant within the Army and Navy, saw the embargo as an unacceptable humiliation and an act of war. They argued that capitulating to American demands would mean abandoning Japan's imperial vision and sacrificing its hard-won gains. For them, there were only two choices: submit to American economic pressure and become a second-rate power, or seize the resources they needed by force. This latter option, while fraught with risk, presented itself as the only path to national survival and fulfillment of their imperial destiny. The do-or-die mentality took firm root. Japan would either fight for its resources or face inevitable economic collapse and national decline. 2.3. Admiral Yamamoto's vision, the dagger to the throat. Amidst this growing crisis, one figure stood out for his chilling foresight and strategic brilliance: Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of Japan's combined fleet. Initially, Yamamoto was a vocal opponent of war with America. Famously warning Prime Minister Kano, this understanding led him to conceive of the audacious plan to attack the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. 2.4. Planning the strike. Innovation and secrecy. The conceptual brilliance of Yamamoto's plan lay in its tactical execution. Largely masterminded by Commander Minoru Genda, an elite naval aviator and staff officer, extensive training and preparation were undertaken with absolute secrecy. The spearhead of the attack force was the Kido Butte, Japan's first air fleet, an unparalleled concentration of naval air power. Maintaining absolute secrecy was paramount to the success of the operation. The fleet's movements were cloaked in deception. 2.5. Missed signals and misinterpretations. The fog of war. While Japan meticulously prepared its surprise strike, American intelligence was not entirely blind. Yet it tragically suffered from a dangerous combination of missed signals, misinterpretations, and a prevailing bias. The overwhelming focus of American intelligence, particularly in Washington, was on Southeast Asia and the Philippines. Analysts believe that Japan's desperate need for oil and rubber made the resource rich, Dutch East Indies and British Malaya the most likely targets. The Philippines, an American territory with vital airfields and naval bases, was seen as a secondary but inevitable target in any Japanese push south. This lengthy diplomatic message, designed by Japan to be delivered before the attack, effectively breaking off negotiations, was intercepted and decrypted by American intelligence hours before the assault. However, due to administrative delays, a misplaced page, and the sheer volume of intelligence, the message was not fully decoded, translated, and delivered to Secretary of State Cordell Hull until moments after the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. Hull's furious dismissal of the Japanese envoys, Nomura and Kurasu, only minutes after the attack began, marked the formal end of diplomacy and the tragic confirmation of Japan's intentions. The fog of war, combined with ingrained assumptions and logistical missteps, had allowed the Japanese attack force to approach undetected, poised to unleash its devastating surprise. In Washington, the final, futile attempts at negotiation were playing out. While in the vastness of the Pacific, Japan's formidable strike force, the Kido Butte, was silently closing in. On the Hawaiian island of Oahu, thousands of American servicemen were preparing for a typical Sunday morning, blissfully unaware that they stood on the precipice of a cataclysm. Its location, roughly equidistant from the U.S. mainland and Japan, made it an indispensable forward operating base, crucial for projecting American power across the vast Pacific. The deep, sheltered waters of the harbor provided an ideal anchorage for a significant portion of the fleet, a symbol of American might. The surrounding airfields, such as Wheeler Field and Hickam Field, housed hundreds of Army Air Forces and Navy aircraft ready to support the fleet. The Enterprise was at sea, returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island. The Lexington was en route to Midway with aircraft. The Saratoga was on the west coast for repairs. These carriers, soon to prove the dominant weapon of naval warfare, had escaped the trap. Their absence would be a critical factor in the subsequent course of the Pacific War, ensuring that the core of America's offensive naval power remained intact. They were intercepting and decrypting a lengthy 14-part message from Tokyo to its envoys in Washington. The decryption process was laborious and slow, even for the highly skilled American codebreakers. Once decoded, the message had to be typed, translated, and analyzed. A key error occurred when one typist misfiled a section, further delaying the assembly of the complete message. By the time it was fully prepared, it was well past the intended delivery time. This message, known as the 14-part message, was a final, comprehensive communication outlining Japan's rejection of American proposals and effectively breaking off diplomatic relations. Crucially, the final part of the message was to be delivered to Secretary Hull at 1 p.m. Washington time on December 7th. This specific timing was critical. 1 p.m. Washington time corresponded to 7:30 a.m. in Hawaii, just 20 minutes before the planned start of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese intent was to ensure that the declaration of broken relations was made just prior to or concurrently with the opening of hostilities. Maintaining a semblance of international protocol, their absence, however, would do little to mitigate the immediate devastation that was about to unfold upon the sleeping giant in Pearl Harbor. Yet, despite the presence of such immense military power, there was an overarching sense of calm, almost complacency. It was a routine Sunday morning. Many sailors were ashore, enjoying leave, attending church services, or simply relaxing. Those on board were engaged in routine maintenance, preparing for breakfast, or sleeping in. The atmosphere was one of peace, not the tension of a nation on the brink of war. The hours leading up to December 7, 1941, were a tragic confluence of ordinary routines, desperate last-minute intelligence. 8 of the U.S. Navy's 9 battleships were present, anchored in neat rows, gleaming in the tropical sun. These mighty vessels, the Arizona, Oklahoma, California, West Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, Nevada, and Pennsylvania, where the pride of the fleet's desperate act of diplomacy was playing out in Washington. D.C. Secretary of State Cordell Hull had been engaged in protracted and increasingly acrimonious negotiations with Japanese envoys. Ambassador Kichisabu Nomura and Special Envoy Saburo Kurisu. For weeks, these discussions had been going nowhere, largely because Japan's military leadership had already committed to war and had no intention of making concessions that would halt their expansion. The American position, encapsulated in the Hull Note of November 26th, demanded Japan's full withdrawal from China and Indochina. A demand Japan considered an unacceptable ultimatum, very embodiment of naval power in an era where battleships were still considered the ultimate arbiters of sea control. Their presence in the harbor was a testament to the belief that the Pacific Fleet, concentrated and ready, served as a deterrent to Japanese aggression. The concentration of these capital ships, however, also made them a single, irresistible target for an enemy seeking a knockout blow. An agonizing near misses that would forever alter the course of history. The stage was now set for the infamous day. The prevailing assumption was that Japan would not dare to attack the U.S. mainland or its primary naval base in Hawaii. Believing such an act would be too audacious and strategically irrational, inevitably leading to a full-scale war with America that Japan could not win. This underestimation of Japanese capabilities and audacity proved to be a fatal flaw. Warnings were sent to Pearl Harbor and other Pacific commands, but these warnings were vague and often contradictory. They spoke of the possibility of war, cautioned about sabotage, and ordered increased vigilance. But they never specifically mentioned an attack on Pearl Harbor itself. General Walter Short, the Army commander in Hawaii, and Admiral Husband Kimmel, the Navy commander, received these messages but interpreted them through the lens of existing biases. Short, for instance, was more concerned about sabotage from the large Japanese-American population in Hawaii than an aerial attack, leading him to cluster aircraft on airfields for easier guarding, making them perfect targets. The culmination of these missed signals was the delayed decryption of Japan's 14-part message on the morning of December 7th. Part 3. The Eve of Infamy. December 6th and early December 7th, the world's diplomatic tightrope had frayed to its last thread. 3.1. Pearl Harbor. A sleeping giant. Pearl Harbor, located on the island of Oahu in the territory of Hawaii, was not merely a naval base. It was the strategic heart of the United States Pacific Fleet. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the harbor was crowded. Beyond the battleships, other crucial naval assets dotted the harbor: cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and numerous auxiliary ships. In a stroke of extraordinary, almost miraculous luck for the Americans, the U.S. Pacific Fleet's 3 aircraft carriers, the USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga, were not in port on that fateful morning. 3.2. Last-minute diplomatic failure. The message that was too late as the Japanese fleet steamed silently towards Hawaii. The final on the evening of December 6th and into the early hours of December 7th. American intelligence achieved a critical breakthrough. However, a series of compounding delays, logistical failures, and human error prevented this critical intelligence from reaching the right hands in time. Finally, at approximately 2 p.m. Washington time, nearly an hour after the attack on Pearl Harbor had already begun, Ambassador Nomura and Special Envoy Kirisu arrived at Secretary Hull's office to deliver the message. Hull, already informed of the attack by President Roosevelt, who had heard early radio reports, was enraged. Each, tragically, was either misunderstood, dismissed, or acted upon too late to make a difference. These were not vague intelligence intercepts, but concrete events that should have sounded a general alarm. Ramsey, realizing the gravity of the report, immediately passed it up the chain of command. First to Admiral Kimmel's staff, and then to Admiral Robert H. Theobald, the Chief of Staff for the Pacific Fleet. However, the report was met with a degree of skepticism and caution. Had either been acted upon decisively, had a full alert been sounded, fighter planes scrambled, or ships put to sea, the devastation might have been significantly lessened. But a combination of bad luck, systemic failures in intelligence interpretation, ingrained assumptions. The 6 aircraft carriers, magnificent vessels of war, turned into the wind, their decks a hive of frantic activity, beneath the eerie glow of floodlights. Hundreds of mechanics and ground crew busied themselves, fueling, arming, and making last-minute checks on the planes. As his formation proceeded south towards Oahu, the sun began to rise behind them, silhouetting the American island against the dawn sky. The pilots could see the distinct volcanic peaks of Oahu, and soon, Awa. The verdant valleys and the glittering waters of Pearl Harbor came into view. Below them, the ships lay serene and unsuspecting, perfectly aligned targets. There was no sign of defensive fighters, no frantic anti-aircraft fire. The element of surprise which Yamamoto had gambled everything on was complete.
Ow.
The pilots, many of them hardened veterans of the war in China, donned their flight suits. Their faces a mixture of intense concentration and grim determination. Each understood the immense stakes of this mission, and a general lack of urgency tragically conspired to leave Pearl Harbor unprepared for the storm that was just minutes away.
The commanders.
Admiral Husband Kimmel of the Pacific Fleet and General Walter Short of the Army's Hawaiian Department bore the ultimate responsibility for the state of readiness. While they had received vague warnings about possible hostilities, their primary concern had been sabotage within the islands, leading Short to cluster aircraft on airfields for easier guarding, ironically making them perfect targets for aerial attack. The defenses were down, the watch was relaxed, and the harbor was about to become a death trap. There was confusion over whether the submarine was Japanese, or perhaps an American vessel, and whether it was merely a single, isolated incident, or part of a larger, coordinated attack. The process of verifying the report and deciding on a course of action was slow, taking precious minutes that Hawaii did not have. No general alarm was sounded, no immediate heightened alert ordered for the entire fleet. One by one, then in rapid succession, the sleek Zero fighters, the robust Valdive bombers, and the modified Kate torpedo bombers lifted off the carrier decks, ascending into the still dark sky. The air quickly filled with the roar of engines, a sound that would soon be etched into the memory of every man at Pearl Harbor. At a total of 183 aircraft, a meticulously planned formation, formed up in the pre-dawn gloom, their navigation guided by the stars and the rising sun behind them. He had waited patiently for the envoys, unaware of the horrific events unfolding thousands of miles away. Two Army privates, Joseph Lockhart and George Elliott, manning one of the newly installed -270 Seychelles rupees radar sets, a cutting-edge but still experimental technology, detected a massive formation of aircraft approaching from the north, roughly 130 miles out. It was by far the largest blip they had ever seen. They immediately reported their finding to the Information Center, located at Fort Shafter. As they presented the message, Hull, his voice shaking with indignation, unleashed a furious condemnation. Tyler was aware that a flight of B-17 bombers was expected to arrive from the mainland that morning, albeit from a different direction and in smaller numbers. He also knew that some U.S. Navy aircraft were scheduled for training flights. Tyler, influenced by these pre-existing knowledge and lacking experience in interpreting radar signals, dismissed the large blip. "Don't worry about it," he reportedly told the privates. "It's nothing." He assumed it was the expected B-17s. Or perhaps a large flight of friendly planes, and saw no need to raise an alarm. The radar operators, having done their duty, simply continued to track the approaching planes, unaware that they were witnessing the vanguard of the Japanese attack fleet. "In all my 50 years of public service," Hull declared, "I've never seen a document that was more crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions." The Japanese envoys, genuinely unaware of the attack on Pearl Harbor, were stunned and humiliated. The diplomatic charade was over, but the message that was meant to precede the attack had arrived too late. Underscoring the final tragic failure of diplomacy and intelligence, 3.3 Whispers of warning, the missed alarms. Even as the diplomatic clock ticked towards midnight, the WW2 steamed towards its target. Several immediate tangible warnings presented themselves in the hours directly preceding the attack. The first significant incident occurred at approximately 6:37 a.m. Hawaiian time, just over an hour before the main attack. The crew of the American destroyer, USS Ward, on patrol outside the entrance to Pearl Harbor, spotted a suspicious object, a small submarine, clearly not American, attempting to enter the harbor's restricted waters. The Ward immediately engaged, firing its deck gun and dropping depth charges. The submarine, later identified as a Japanese midget submarine, was successfully sunk. The Ward's captain, Lieutenant William W. Outerbridge, promptly sent a radio message reporting the engagement to headquarters. This was a direct, unambiguous act of hostile contact. The message from the USS Ward reached Lieutenant Commander Logan C. Ramsey, operations officer for the Hawaiian Sea Frontier. Barely an hour later, at approximately 7:02 a.m., another critical warning appeared on the radar screen at Apana Point, located on the northern tip of Oahu. The report was received by Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, a newly assigned and inexperienced officer who was undergoing radar training. These two critical warnings, the sinking of the midget submarine and the detection of the incoming air armada, were the last opportunities to prepare Pearl Harbor for the onslaught. 3.4 The Japanese approach. The last leg, meanwhile, in the pre-dawn darkness. The Japanese First Air Fleet, the WW2, had reached its launch point approximately 230 miles north of Oahu. At 6 a.m. Hawaiian time, the first wave of aircraft roared to life. The lead pilot, Commander Mitsuo Fukita, flying a Kate bomber, led the first attack wave. On Oahu, life proceeded with typical Sunday tranquility. On the battleships, some sailors were just waking up, others were heading to breakfast in the mess halls. On the USS Arizona, buglers sounded colors at 7:55 a.m., signifying the raising of the flag. On other ships, church services were preparing to begin. Some crewmen were on shore leave, enjoying the last moments of a peaceful weekend. And civilians, as the first bombs fell, marked the precise moment when the illusion of peace shattered. The tranquil waters of Pearl Harbor, reflecting the clear blue sky, were about to be transformed into a cauldron of fire, smoke, and unimaginable destruction. The first screams, the first explosions, heralded a new era for America and for the world. The attack had begun. Radios played music, conversations drifted across the water, and the sounds of a bustling but relaxed naval base filled the air. There was no sense of impending doom, no heightened alert, only the calm rhythm of a Sunday morning in paradise. Then, just before 7:55 a.m., the distant hum of engines began to grow. An unusual sound for a Sunday morning training flight. Suddenly, the first aircraft appeared on the horizon, not American but Japanese, with the distinctive red Hinomaru insignia on their wings. They swooped low over the airfields, unleashing a torrent of machine gun fire and bombs on the grounded aircraft. A 14,000-word script means each section is quite long, and the attack sequence could easily become overwhelming with too much detail. Confusion quickly turned to horror, and then to a desperate scramble. The first wave of Japanese aircraft, having flown undetected through the dawn sky, descended upon Pearl Harbor and its surrounding airfields with devastating precision. The pilots, rigorously trained for this moment, knew their targets. The initial seconds of the assault were marked by disorienting chaos, sudden, brutal awakening for a nation utterly unprepared. The next part will be the most dramatic and detailed, the attack itself. The quiet anticipation among those few on watch, the dawning realization on the faces of sailors, but it was the USS Arizona that truly bore the brunt of the initial, catastrophic assault. At approximately 8:06 a.m., a Japanese Valdive bomber released an armor-piercing bomb that penetrated the Arizona's deck and detonated in her forward magazine. The explosion was cataclysmic. A blinding flash of light, followed by a thunderous roar, ripped the battleship apart. The forward section of the ship lifted clear out of the water before collapsing back down, engulfed in a towering inferno. More than 1,000 gallons of fuel oil erupted, spreading fire across the harbor's surface. While the element of complete surprise was gone, the devastation continued. This wave primarily consisted of high-level bombers and dive bombers, targeting ships that had survived the initial onslaught, as well as the shipyard facilities, dry docks, and remaining airfields. Within minutes, the USS Arizona sank, taking 1,177 of her crew to their deaths, many of them trapped below decks, instantly becoming the most poignant symbol of the attack's sudden savagery. The USS Nevada, which had attempted to get underway and escape the harbor, became a primary target. Having initially dodged the worst of the first wave's torpedoes, her movement made her stand out. The sounds of explosions began to recede, replaced by the crackle of immense fires, the hiss of steam, and the cries of the wounded. For those who had endured the assault, the silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the attack itself, a chilling void filled only by the horrific panorama of destruction. She was repeatedly bombed, and to prevent her from sinking in the narrow channel and blocking the harbor entrance, her commanding officer intentionally ran her aground. The fires aboard other battleships flared anew under the sustained attack, complicating rescue efforts and threatening further explosions. With particular attention paid to the large dry docks and maintenance facilities. However, in a critical strategic oversight, the massive fuel storage tanks at Pearl Harbor, containing millions of gallons of aviation fuel and oil crucial for the fleet, were largely left untouched. The Japanese strategists had focused on immediate tactical victory, failing to recognize the long-term strategic value of these vulnerable logistical targets. Had they been destroyed, the U.S. Pacific Fleet would have been severely hampered for months, not years, in any offensive operations across the Pacific. This single omission would prove to be a profound strategic error for Japan. Struck by no fewer than 9 torpedoes, the battleship quickly listed violently to port. Trapped sailors pounded on the hull from inside as the ship capsized within minutes, trapping 429 crew members who either drowned or suffocated. Rescue efforts would immediately begin, with heroic attempts to cut through the hull to reach survivors. This concludes Part 3, adding approximately 2,000 words. We're now at approximately 6,000 words total. Both ships were hit multiple times, slowly settling into the harbor mud. Their decks awash in oil and water, but remaining largely upright. On the USS West Virginia, Messman Third Class Doris Miller, an African-American sailor, relegated to non-combat duties, manned an anti-aircraft machine gun, for which he had no training, bringing down at least one Japanese plane. His courage under fire would later earn him the Navy Cross, the first foreign African-American in World War II. Throughout the harbor, sailors and officers dazed and disoriented, began to mount a desperate defense, firing back with whatever weapons they could bring to bear. Anti-aircraft guns, initially slow to react, began to spit streams of fire into the sky, creating a dangerous gauntlet for the second wave of attackers. Heroic actions by their crews kept them from fully capsizing, buying time for hundreds to be rescued, though both sustained heavy casualties. The USS Maryland and USS Tennessee, moored inboard of other battleships, suffered less direct torpedo damage, but were hit by bombs, causing significant fires and structural damage. The USS Pennsylvania, dry docked for repairs, was also hit by bombs, as was the destroyer USS Shaw, whose forward magazine exploded in a spectacular fireball. Are you ready to proceed with Part 4, the attack? Tora, Tora, Tora. Part 4, please make it shorter, I believe. I am ready for a smaller version. Maybe you're absolutely right to consider pacing and length, especially for the most intense part of the script. Let's make Part 4 more concise, focusing on the most impactful moments in the overall narrative of the attack without getting lost in excessive granular detail for every single event. We'll still convey the horror and scale, but with a tighter narrative. I will aim for around 1,500 to 2,000 words for this section, down from the originally projected 4,000. Part 4, the attack. Tora, Tora, Tora. The tranquility of a Hawaiian Sunday was shattered with an unholy roar. 4.1. The first wave, shock and devastation. At precisely 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time, Commander Mitsuo Fukita, leading the first attack wave, radioed the iconic code word back to the waiting aircraft carriers. Tora, 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 meaning tiger, tiger, tiger. It was the signal that complete surprise had been achieved, and the coordinated assault could begin. The skies over Oahu instantly became a battleground. The Japanese assault began simultaneously on two fronts, the airfields and the battleships. Dive bombers swarmed over Hickam, Wheeler, and Ford Island airfields, strafing rows of parked American planes and dropping bombs that ignited fuel depots and ammunition dumps. Aircraft neatly lined up wingtip to prevent sabotage became easy targets, exploding into infernos before their pilots could even reach them. Within minutes, most of the U.S. Army Air Forces and Navy aircraft on the ground were destroyed or severely damaged, neutralizing any immediate aerial defense. But the main target, the centerpiece of the attack, was the tightly packed battleship row in Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had developed specialized torpedoes, fitted with wooden fins, designed to run true in Pearl Harbor's shallow waters, a feat previously thought impossible. These torpedo bombers, flying low and fast, delivered the most devastating blows. The first ship to suffer a direct hit was the USS Nevada, struck by a torpedo in her bow. Alongside the Arizona, the USS Oklahoma suffered an equally horrific fate. The USS West Virginia and USS California were also heavily targeted by torpedoes and bombs. Amidst the chaos, acts of incredible bravery began to emerge. 4.2. The second wave, continued onslaught. After a brief lull, the second wave of Japanese aircraft, consisting of 171 planes, descended upon the burning harbor at approximately 8:54 a.m. The second wave aimed to solidify the damage inflicted by the first. Japanese pilots were ordered to focus on targets that had been missed or insufficiently damaged. By 9:45 a.m., after approximately 90 minutes of relentless bombing and strafing, the final Japanese aircraft turned and headed back to their carriers. What greeted the stunned survivors was a scene of unimaginable horror and devastation. Black smoke billowed thousands of feet into the sky, obscuring the sun. 188 U.S. aircraft were destroyed, and another 159 damaged, most of them caught on the ground. Sailors, Marines, and civilians, many still in shock, bravely launched into the burning oil, pulling comrades from the water, attempting to cut into capsized hulls, and providing first aid to the wounded. The hospitals on Oahu were quickly overwhelmed, triage areas set up amidst the chaos. The horror of the morning quickly gave way to a grim determination. The air crews returned to a hero's welcome, their mission a resounding success. Despite the tactical brilliance of the attack, Yamamoto understood the deeper strategic implications. The carriers, the future arbiters of naval power, were untouched. The American submarine fleet, a deadly force in its own right, was also largely unscathed. These omissions meant that Japan had bought time, but not victory. He had feared provoking the sleeping giant of American industrial might, in his famous quote often paraphrased. The news initially disbelieved, then confirmed. Swept through a nation that had for years debated its role in a world at war. Suddenly, the debate was over. He knew instantly the profound implications of what had transpired. His voice firm, despite the immense weight of the moment, he delivered one of the most famous speeches in American history. He began yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly a radio stations broadcasted constant updates, newspapers printed banner headlines. And ordinary citizens, previously divided on intervention, now spoke with one voice. The phrase "Remember Pearl Harbor" became an immediate national rallying cry, emblazoned on posters, etched into public consciousness, and fueling the surge of enlistment. The United States now faced war in the Pacific, but the question remained: would it be limited to Japan, or would the European dictatorships also join the fray? The attack had achieved the exact opposite of what Japan had intended. Instead of breaking America's will, it ignited an unyielding resolve to fight and win. This decision, seemingly illogical given that America's immediate fury was directed at Japan, was rooted in Hitler's strategic calculations and his pact with Japan. With these declarations, the United States was now unequivocally embroiled in a two-front global conflict. Facing the combined might of the Axis powers across the vast expanses of the Pacific, the Atlantic, Europe, and North Africa, the world was now fully engulfed in a war of unprecedented scale and consequence. Almost overnight, the lingering economic stagnation of the Great Depression was obliterated by the urgent demands of wartime production. This massive industrial output would prove to be America's single greatest contribution to the Allied victory. Overwhelming the Axis powers through sheer volume and logistical superiority, shipyards worked around the clock, producing Liberty ships and warships at an astonishing rate. Aircraft factories rolled out bombers and fighters in numbers that dwarfed the combined production of Germany and Japan. Factories that had once produced automobiles began churning out tanks, planes, and jeeps. Millions of American men, driven by patriotism and a sense of duty, flocked to enlistment offices, eager to avenge Pearl Harbor. The draft already in place expanded dramatically, calling millions more into service. Training camps sprang up across the nation, transforming civilians into soldiers, sailors, and airmen. Refrigerator manufacturers converted to making ammunition, and typewriter companies switched to gun parts. The nation transformed itself into the arsenal of democracy with breathtaking speed and efficiency. And the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, providing convoys and engaging in undeclared naval warfare in the Atlantic. He likely underestimated America's capacity to wage a two-front war on such a massive scale. Believing that the attack on Pearl Harbor would tie up American resources in the Pacific, leaving Europe vulnerable. Furthermore, Hitler sought to solidify the Axis alliance, hoping to encourage Japan to attack the Soviet Union from the east. Relieving pressure on his struggling forces on the Eastern Front, the Tripartite Pact, signed in September 1940 by Germany, Italy, and Japan, was a defensive alliance, ostensibly committing each nation to assist the others if attacked by a power not currently involved in their existing wars. While the interpretation of the pact was ambiguous regarding an offensive strike like Pearl Harbor, Hitler chose to honor it, or rather exploit it, and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. His address was concise, powerful, and designed to unify a stunned nation. He outlined the facts of the attack, enumerated the targets, and declared that no matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people and their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. This was the moment the United States could no longer remain aloof from the global conflict. Within hours of the attack, despite the chaotic reports still filtering in, Roosevelt began to draft his address to a joint session of Congress. The attack on December 7, 1941 was not just an act of war. It was an unprovoked assault on American soil, an act of infamy that galvanized a divided public into unified resolve, captured his prescient understanding. I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. The vote for war was nearly unanimous. In the Senate, the vote was 82-0, In the House of Representatives, it was 388 to 1. The single dissenting vote came from Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a committed pacifist who had also voted against entry into World War I. Her lonely vote, while a testament to her personal convictions, only served to highlight the unprecedented national consensus. Within hours, President Roosevelt signed the declaration of war against Japan. Formally thrusting the United States into World War II, he knew that the true strength of the United States lay not in its battleships, but in its vast capacity for industrial production, its limitless manpower, and the unbreakable spirit of its people once provoked. News of the devastating blow to the American fleet spread quickly through Japan, met with nationalistic fervor and celebration. The militarists in Tokyo were elated. Their audacious gamble had paid off, at least in the short term. It delivered a crippling blow to their formidable enemy. The human toll was catastrophic. 2,403 Americans were killed, including 68 civilians, and 1,178 were wounded. The vast majority of the dead were sailors and Marines. Japanese losses, by contrast, were minimal. 29 aircraft destroyed, 5 midget submarines sunk, and 64 airmen and submariners killed. It was based on the premise that a single knockout blow would force America to the negotiating table rather than ignite its full wrath. Japan fundamentally underestimated American resilience, its national unity, and its immense potential for war. Instead of crippling America, the attack unified a previously divided nation, instantly transforming a reluctant, isolationist power into a furious, determined adversary committed to total war and the complete destruction of the forces that had dared to strike its homeland. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not the beginning of the end of the war, but rather, as Winston Churchill famously remarked, the end of the beginning for the Allied powers. The sleeping giant had indeed awakened. The tactical victory for Japan was overwhelming and undeniable. The serene blue waters of Pearl Harbor were now a vast slick of burning oil, dotted with debris and the bodies of the fallen. 8 battleships, the very backbone of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, lay sunk or heavily damaged. As mentioned, America's 3 aircraft carriers were all at sea, escaping the devastation. The submarine base, critical for future Pacific operations, was also largely untouched, as were the vital repair facilities. Most significantly, the enormous oil fuel storage tanks, containing enough fuel to supply the Pacific Fleet for months, remained intact. These oversights, though minor in the context of the immediate tactical victory, would prove to be monumental strategic failures for Japan. The USS Arizona and USS Oklahoma were total losses, their hulks either submerged or capsized. The West Virginia, California, and Nevada were resting on the bottom, partially submerged. The Maryland, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania, though damaged, would later be repaired and returned to service. In total, 18 U.S. Navy ships were sunk or damaged. The immediate aftermath was a desperate scramble for survival and rescue. Despite the profound destruction, there were fortunate escapes that would prove crucial for the coming war. 4.4. Japanese perspective and miscalculations. A Pyrrhic victory. On the Japanese carriers, there was initial jubilation. However, amidst the celebrations, a quieter, more somber assessment emerged from the architect of the plan, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The strategic failure to destroy Pearl Harbor's repair facilities and, more critically, its fuel depots meant that the American fleet, though battered, could be repaired and refueled relatively quickly. The Pearl Harbor attack, while tactically brilliant, was a profound strategic miscalculation by Japan. Part 5. America Awakens. From isolation to global war, the smoke was still rising from the ruins of Pearl Harbor. But across the United States, the shock quickly morphed into an incandescent rage. 5.1. A date which will live in infamy. The Declaration of War. President Franklin D. Roosevelt received the news of the Pearl Harbor attack with a mix of shock and grim determination. On December 8, 1941, the very next day, a somber and resolute President Roosevelt stood before Congress and the nation. The response from Congress was immediate and overwhelming. The isolationist movement, which had held sway for so long, vanished overnight. Public reaction across America was one of outrage, anger, and a burning desire for retribution. 5.2. Germany and Italy declare war. A truly global conflict. While the immediate focus was on Japan, Pearl Harbor attack had a cascading effect that rapidly transformed the conflict into a truly global war, involving all the major Axis powers. The answer came swiftly. For days after Pearl Harbor, on December 11, 1941, Nazi Germany declared war on the United States. Several factors likely influenced Hitler's decision. He believed that the United States was already an effective belligerent, actively supporting Britain hours after Germany's declaration. Fascist Italy, under Benito Mussolini, followed suit, declaring war on the United States as well. 5.3. Mobilization and the arsenal of democracy. The nation rises. The declarations of war ignited an unparalleled mobilization effort across the United States. The industrial might of the United States, previously latent, now roared to life. This unprecedented industrial effort required an equally unprecedented mobilization of human resources. But the war effort wasn't confined to the battlefield. On the home front, the traditional roles of society were appended. With millions of men joining the armed forces, women stepped into the industrial workforce in unprecedented numbers, filling jobs previously held exclusively by men. Iconic figures like Rosie the Riveter symbolized the strength and determination of these women, who took on grueling work in factories, shipyards, and munitions plants, playing an indispensable role in the war economy. Rationing of essential goods like food, gasoline, and rubber became a part of daily life, as did scrap drives and victory gardens, all contributing to the collective war effort. The entire nation was united, psychologically and physically, in a total war. Fueled by the memory of Pearl Harbor and an unshakable resolve to achieve absolute victory, the attack on December 7, 1941 was not merely a military event. It was a profound historical pivot, irrevocably altering the course of World War II, reshaping America's role in the world, and leaving a complex legacy that continues to resonate today. The shock of that Sunday morning set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately define the 20th century. The Philippines fell, Wake Island and Guam were captured, and British and Dutch forces suffered heavy losses across Southeast Asia. Japan achieved its initial territorial objectives, securing the vital oil, rubber, and tin resources it had desperately sought. Despite the immediate provocation from Japan, the Allied powers, including the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union, agreed to a Germany-first strategy. The reasoning was clear. Nazi Germany was considered the primary most dangerous threat to global democracy and freedom. Its industrial capacity, scientific advancements, and genocidal ideology posed an existential danger that had to be addressed first. African Americans served in segregated units and faced discrimination both in the military and on the home front. Driven by fear, hysteria, and long-standing racial prejudice, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 in February 1942, authorizing the forced removal and incarceration of over 1,200 Americans of Japanese descent, two-thirds of whom were U.S. citizens, from their homes on the West Coast to desolate internment camps. This mass deprivation of civil liberties, based solely on ancestry, remains a stark reminder of how wartime fear can erode fundamental constitutional rights. The most poignant symbol is the USS Arizona Memorial. It's built directly over the sunken hull of the battleship, where 1,177 crewmen remain entombed. Oil still occasionally seeps from the sunken ship, creating shimmering black patches on the water's surface. It's often called black tears, a continuous tribute to those who perished. Visitors from around the world come to pay their respects, to reflect on the events of that day, and to honor the sacrifices made. However, the fight against fascism abroad fueled a growing demand for civil rights at home. Encapsulated by the Double V campaign, victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. Their testimonies, recounted in countless books, documentaries, and personal interviews, keep the memory of the attack alive, ensuring that future generations understand the terror, the heroism, and the profound impact of December 7th. Their lives were forever marked by what they witnessed, and their experiences serve as a bridge to a past that must never be forgotten. Rationing, price controls, and massive government spending became commonplace. It underscored the critical importance of preparedness, the dangers of underestimating an adversary, and the devastating consequences of intelligence failures and misinterpretations. It taught the world about the perils of unchecked aggression and the ultimate cost of diplomatic inaction. But perhaps its most powerful lesson lies in the extraordinary resilience of the American spirit. From the ashes of that catastrophic morning, a nation unified and determined to fight for freedom rose with an unwavering resolve. The post-war era saw the expansion of the federal government's role in areas like education, housing, and infrastructure. It was the moment the United States irrevocably entered World War II, conflict that would redefine the world order and establish America's place at its forefront. The legacy of December 7, 1941, is a complex tapestry of loss and heroism, a stark warning and an enduring testament to national unity, forever marking the point when the world's most devastating conflict truly became a global war. Perhaps most significantly, the war cemented the United States' emergence as a global superpower. It ended the last vestiges of American isolationism, thrusting the nation onto the world stage as a dominant military, economic, and political force, a role it would maintain for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The Great Migration continued, as African Americans moved from the rural South to industrial centers in the North and West in search of wartime jobs. Further shifting the nation's demographics and intensifying calls for equality, this dual commitment demonstrated the unparalleled industrial and logistical might of the United States, capable of fighting and winning a two-front global war on a scale never before seen in human history. However, the U.S. Pacific Fleet, though crippled at Pearl Harbor, was not destroyed. Crucially, the aircraft carriers, the future spearhead of naval warfare, were untouched. The immense demand for labor in factories and shipyards drew millions of women into the workforce, particularly married women, in roles traditionally dominated by men. Rosie the Riveter became a powerful symbol of female empowerment and contribution, fundamentally altering perceptions of women's capabilities and their place in the economy. While many women would return to domestic roles after the war, their wartime contributions laid crucial groundwork for future social changes and the women's rights movement. Their survival allowed the U.S. Navy to quickly transition to carrier-based strategies that would prove decisive. The sleeping giant was fully awake, and its power was about to be unleashed upon the world. In a stunning reversal, the U.S. Navy inflicted a crushing defeat on the Imperial Japanese Navy, sinking 4 of Japan's frontline aircraft carriers, the very same carriers that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack. Midway irrevocably shifted the balance of naval power in the Pacific and marked the beginning of the long, arduous island-hopping campaign that would eventually lead American forces to Japan's doorstep. The course of the war, from catastrophe to global conflict, instead of achieving a negotiated peace or a weakened America, it sparked a national fury that united a previously fractured nation behind a singular, unyielding objective: total victory. The attack removed any lingering doubt about America's commitment to the war. It's not just against Japan, but against the entire Axis alliance. Part 6. Legacy and Lasting Impact. The guns of Pearl Harbor fell silent, but their echoes reverberated across the globe for decades. 6.1. Pearl Harbor, initially a catastrophic tactical defeat for the United States, proved to be a strategic disaster for Japan. The immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor saw a series of early brutal defeats for the Allies in the Pacific. The first major turning point in the Pacific War came just 6 months after Pearl Harbor. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, while the Pacific War raged, the United States simultaneously committed vast resources to the European theater. 6.2. Societal changes in America, a nation transformed. The entry into World War II profoundly transformed American society, accelerating social and economic changes that had been simmering for decades. The war also highlighted, and in some ways exacerbated, racial tensions within the United States. Yet one of the darkest chapters in American history unfolded directly as a result of Pearl Harbor: the Japanese-American internment. The war also ushered in an era of unprecedented federal power and government intervention in the economy and daily lives of Americans. 6.3. Remembering Pearl Harbor, a permanent scar, a powerful lesson. Today, Pearl Harbor stands as a solemn memorial and a powerful reminder of the costs of war and the enduring spirit of resilience. The stories of the survivors, of those who lived through the inferno, continue to serve as vital first-hand accounts. The lessons of Pearl Harbor are multifaceted and enduring. Pearl Harbor remains etched in American memory, not just as a day of tragedy, but as the day the nation truly awakened to its global responsibilities and its own immense power.